the Internet Governance Lab. So I'm the little Venn diagram of overlapping institutions here. And I could not be more pleased to have these estimable Internet scholars and researchers on this panel. I will leave it to Dustin from ISOC to introduce them and to explain more about this event. Thank you very much for being here. A few logistics really quickly. The bathrooms are down the hall and to the left, and we have about an hour and a half, and there will be time for questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Aram, and we'd like to thank American University and the Internet Governance Lab for hosting us today for this great panel on choosing better technologies for the Internet and ultimately who decides. So the hashtag for this panel will be hashtag #TechDecides. So those of you in the room and those of you following online, please take an opportunity to tweet this out. I will try not to take too much of your time and just get straight to it. So I will introduce our moderator, Ari Schwartz. Ari Schwartz is Venable's Managing Director of Cybersecurity Services. He directs the firm's cybersecurity consulting services, assisting organizations with understanding and developing risk management strategies, including implementation of cybersecurity framework and other planning tools to help minimize the risk. Previously, Mr. Schwartz served at the White House National Security Council as Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Cybersecurity, where he led legislative and policy outreach to businesses, trade groups, and others. Before his work at the White House, Schwartz led the Department of Commerce Internet Policy Task Force, worked at the National Institute of Standards and Technology, and served for 12 years at the Center for Democracy and Technology. So, Ari, I would like to give the floor to you.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here today. And I'm supposed to start by giving the overview for the folks on Twitter. If they have questions, they can write into #TechDecides, and someone here will be your voice in the audience, and your questions will be answered, at least to the best of the ability of the panel. We're going to go down the base. I'm going to start with Alissa Cooper. Alissa is the chair of the Internet Engineering Task Force, the IETF. She previously served for 3 years as an IETF Applications in Real-Time Area Director, and 3 years on the Internet Architecture Board, the IAB. She served as the chair of the IANA Stewardship Coordination Group, and then her day job is as a fellow at Cisco Systems, where before being appointed as IETF chair, she was responsible for driving privacy and policy strategy within the company's portfolio of real-time collaboration products. And before joining Cisco, Alissa served as the chief computer scientist at the Center for Democracy and Technology. Alissa, why don't you start, and then I'll introduce the others before they speak.
Thanks, Ari, and thank you to American University and the Internet Governance Lab and ISOC DC for organizing this event. Very important and timely set of topics. As Ari said, I am the chair of the Internet Engineering Task Force. Can I just see a show of hands of how many people are familiar with the IETF? Everybody, just about. Okay, good. I don't have to give that intro. But I thought, given my role, that it might be useful to set the stage a little bit to first think about what is the role of standards and standards development organizations in the broader technology landscape, and then specifically with respect to security. Because if you think about even just, for example, a single web request that you might make with your browser, many different standard technologies are implicated by that. Lots of IETF standards, so a single web request, you would use IP, you'd use HTTP, DNS, TLS probably, but it's not just the IETF. You would use a bunch of W3C standards, certainly some standards produced by the IEEE, 802.11 if you're using Wi-Fi, for example. You might use X509 certificates produced by the ITUT, yet another standards organization. So even just a single web request implicates standards from multiple different standards organizations. And at the same time, it also implicates the design decisions from many different parties. Everyone from the company that designed the chip in your laptop to your operating system vendor, your ISP, the company running the web server, the CDN, the DNS provider, third-party providers of content. And it's the collection of individual design decisions that all of these different entities made that together determine the security properties of that single web connection. There's a lot of players involved here. And when there's that many players involved, it's really important to kind of scope out, well, what is the role and responsibility of each of them? And the one that I can speak to the best is the role of the standards organization, and specifically the role of the IETF. So in the IETF, what we do is we build building blocks and we specify architectures. So our goal is to create the tools that implementers can go off and use and incorporate into their products and into their systems in order to produce interoperable systems on the internet. What we do not do is build those systems ourselves, nor do we build the products ourselves. So we're trying to create a toolkit for people to be able to put things together in different ways to advance innovation and engineering on the internet, but we're not trying to actually build the full system top to bottom ourselves. The other kind of constraint around the work in the IETF is that our focus is internet-wide. So if you have a particular problem with a private network or something that you want to do in your enterprise or specifically in your data center, that scope is a little too narrow for us. It's not that IETF standards can't be used in those kinds of situations, but when we're looking at a particular engineering problem, our focus is how will this work on internet scale from one end of the network to the other. And so together, those two constraints really mean that the things that we do in the IETF can have really wide applicability, but they also have to accommodate a really broad range of use cases and different kinds of incentive systems. And you see all of those tensions and pressures being played out as we advance IETF standards. So that's just kind of to put a little bit of a boundary around what can you expect from a standards organization like the IETF versus what could you expect from an individual company offering some service on the internet or running some piece of infrastructure on the internet. In the IETF, we have a long history of thinking about security. The first standard in the IETF standards are called RFCs. You probably know that. The first RFC that actually required security considerations to be documented in all of our specifications was written in 1993. So we've been thinking about security at least that long, if not longer. And I would say that the number one lesson that we've learned as far as how do you design standardized technology for security is the need to align the incentives for deployment of security with other deployment incentives. So to marry advances in security to other things that the people who need to deploy this stuff actually already want. And we have actually a couple of good examples of this. I think some of my colleagues on the panel might speak to DNSSEC and BGPSEC where maybe the incentives have been a little bit misaligned. But I wanted to focus on some more recent developments in the web protocol stack where that I think really demonstrate how well we've learned this lesson. And the other reason why looking at the web is particularly interesting is because we've seen a dramatic change just in the last few years. So if you look back in 2013 or so, something like a quarter of web traffic was encrypted using HTTPS. If you look at that now, depending on how you measure, it's definitely the majority. It's probably something more like 70%. So that's a pretty dramatic change in a short amount of time, and there's a good question there about why is that happening and what's going to continue to happen in the future. And we can look at three standards initiatives in particular that I think demonstrate this alignment of incentives that we've learned about. The first one is HTTP 2. So this is the newest version of HTTP. It was standardized in 2015. And it really took this idea to heart. The original motivating impetus for HTTP 2 was to improve the performance of HTTP to solve a sort of queuing problem that was known to be existent in the older version of HTTP. And this is very important to everybody on the web. Users and web servers alike all recognize everyone wants their web traffic to be faster. And so that was one important goal and part of how the design worked out. But effectively, HTTP 2 has to be deployed in an encrypted fashion. It's not baked into the standard, but effectively that's how it has worked out. And so we basically tied the need for the traffic to be encrypted to the design decisions that cause the traffic to go faster, and now everybody wants to deploy security because it's just part of what you get when you deploy HTTP 2. Now we've basically taken this formula and repeated it with some newer standards that are closer to finalization or a little bit more nascent. So the one that's close to finalization is called TLS 1.3 Transport Layer Security. It's the latest version of Transport Layer Security. I would say the most widely deployed security standard on the internet, at least from the IETF. And again, same idea here. We're trying to cut down on the time it takes to set up a TLS connection. That was one of the main motivations for working on TLS 1.3. But at the same time, you get a bunch of security benefits. There's deprecation of cryptographic algorithms that have shown to be vulnerable. You automatically get that with TLS 1.3. And there's something called forward secrecy, where there's been a shift from the use of the same encryption keys for every transaction to a state of play where you get a different set of encryption keys every time, which means that if one set of keys gets compromised, you're not necessarily compromising all future transactions that happen, or all past transactions that happen using the protocol. So these are two major security advances that you get along with the performance benefits of TLS 1.3. And then finally, there's an even newer protocol called QUIC, QUIC, which is at the transport layer, so a layer lower than HTTP. But again, it's the same idea, trying to take some of what we learned in HTTP 2 and repeat that in terms of performance enhancement at the transport layer, and marry that with security benefits. QUIC does not run in unencrypted mode. There's no unencrypted mode. It's always encrypted. And actually encrypts even more of the packet than what you get with the other protocols. So I just wanted to highlight those three examples because they're very current. It's things that the IETF has recently worked on or is working on right now. And I do think they illustrate that the way that you get things deployed on the internet is by giving people what they want, together with maybe a little bit of what they know that they need but aren't as motivated to deploy in the form of security. I also think, if we're thinking about, how do we improve security on the internet, these are good examples to consider because they're kind of the state of the art as opposed to some of the legacy stuff that we've been living with for a longer period of time.
So we hide the spinach in the pasta, that's what you're saying?
That is a great way to explain it. I'm totally going to use that in the future. As the mother of two very small children, that really resonates with me.
The next up is Olafur Gudmundsson. He is the Director for Engineering at Cloudflare, where he leads Cloudflare's implementation of DNSSEC and other DNS products. He is also the chair of a few IETF standards and editor and author of Dane, most prominently, I think. And prior to his work at Cloudflare, he ran his own consulting company, OGUD Consulting. Olafur.
Thank you. Like Alissa just told us about, the internet is a complicated place. And we have been learning a lot over the years. When I started working in the IETF, there were only a few hundred of us that attended each meeting. Everybody knew, almost everybody, whether it was an operator or an implementer or people who deployed things. But things have evolved a lot. We have now a very large ecosystem that we have to satisfy. And different parts of these ecosystems have a different motivations of what they want and what they consider to be security, and sometimes even it depends on the time of day what their opinion of security is. Think about it. You are a chief security officer for a company. Your biggest problem may be today to avoid information leaking out of your home, out of the company. But when you go home, you worry more about your privacy and what you are doing on the net. So we have, in the protocol deployment, run into many obstacles that were not necessarily foreseen, and we have been learning from that, like Alissa pointed out very clearly. So there are certain things that are relatively easy to change in the internet. There are other things that are really hard. Stuff like Andrew and I worked on the DNS security. We have had a fight over 20 years to get that deployed and still not working. There are a number of reasons for it. The people are slow and they worry about something that is totally at the bottom of the protocol stack and every transaction on the internet requires to work correctly. There is all kinds of hardware and software that has been deployed in the world that is with the following assumption: nothing will change. So they embed into it that what they have saw when the software was developed, that is going to be the way everything evolves. So no changes, nothing new can come in. And many protocols in the old days were designed in a way that makes it very hard to extend them. So getting standards out the door is very hard and requires to have the right alignment of priorities. And we need operators to deal with it. We need also people to understand that are making decisions what is important and for who. If we are talking about encryption for everybody on all connections, there are going to be entities that say that is a bad thing, and they have perfectly good reasons why they have that opinion and why they want it. There are people who do all kinds of strange things and the way packets travel from one place to another one that have absolutely no logical explanation when you look at it, but when you think about it, yes, there may be some hidden agendas or perfectly reasonable agendas. There is a famous example, for example, that if you are in a certain building in Toronto and you want to change traffic with an office that is on the floor below, the traffic goes through Chicago. Okay. BGP security is another thing that has been very hard to deploy because it is in the core. It affects the traffic of every packet that traverses outside of a certain administrative boundaries. And the people who operate that are extremely careful. Getting new things in there is very hard. The router vendors sometimes want it, sometimes they don't want it. The registries for routes may support it, may not support it. The technologies that are picked may or may not scale. In many cases, we have had to go through multiple iterations of protocols, and every time we go through an iteration, we hear the same song. Oh, you got it wrong last time, so you must be wrong this time again. But we are trying to improve the performance, we're trying to improve the security, and the only way we can do that is to learn and align economic factors. And sometimes the factors aren't totally misaligned. One of the security issues that people talk a lot about is DDoS attacks. Today is a very bad day for DDoS attacks because somebody discovered a new attack the other day. And people around the world are trying to stop it very hard, and if my phone beeps, I apologize for that. But I'm on call, sorry. But we need to, that is not necessarily the only security threat we have. It is basically to stop, what people are doing with this attack is to fill pipes. They're not trying to break into anything. So there is nothing that's going to leak. They are just making a denial of accessibility. Or doing it for fun, whatever reason it is. And it is dirt cheap to do this attack. It is really expensive to defend against it. So the economical factors have to be aligned for security things. If it costs a lot for some party of the ecosystem to deploy it with a minimal benefit, they're not going to deploy it. And new technologies that are coming out of the IATF to a large extent are starting to learn from this. HTTP2 is something that I was going to mention before. Alissa covered it very well. It is an amazing opportunity to improve both performance and security on the internet. And there are all kinds of things that we can do possibly in the space of software-defined networks that allows us to do better collaborations between different parties. And also, I would like to mention captive portals. Captive portals are probably the biggest threat to your privacy on the internet, if you use them. But you probably use one or two every day, every time you go into a coffee shop, every time you go into an office building, every time you use a guest network, something like that. Do you know what these networks do to your devices? Assume the worst. And with that cherry thought, hopefully the IETF will fix it. So you can find the good captive portals and not the bad ones.
Thanks, Oliver. Next up is Andrew Sullivan. Andrew's a Dine Fellow at Oracle Dine. Andrew has worked on internet infrastructure and standards since 2001. He was a member of the IETF's Internet Architecture Board from 2013 until 2017, and he was chair of the IAB from 2015 to 2017. And while he lives in Toronto, he has the in the bio I'm supposed to read here, he has the standard Washington disclaimer, which I'm proud to read on his behalf. Andrew is an employee of the Oracle Corporation, but the views he expresses are his own and do not necessarily represent the views of the Oracle Corporation. Andrew.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me here today. I edited out of that the "or even probably," but I understand this is webcast, so I didn't say that out loud. I was thinking a lot about this question of who decides, and maybe that's because I'm in D.C. right now, and when I'm in D.C., I'm often talking to people in government, and somebody who works in this space said to me once a number of years ago that when policy people and politicians and so on get together, they ask, "Who are you?" And when engineers get together, they ask, "What do you do?" And I don't know whether that's true, although I do have the experience of a lot of people asking me, "What do you do?" If it's true, then this strikes me as one of those cases where the question is only going to be understood differently by the different actors in this space. And that is, in some sense, a kind of strength of the internet, despite the fact that we have these examples of some protocols that perhaps would increase security on the internet, but haven't been widely deployed. So why do I say that's a strength if we're not getting this advantage? Well, people forget all the time, because we're wiping it out from the way we talk about this, that the internet is not a noun in the usual way, right? I say this all the time, so Greg I see is smiling because he's heard this speech before. The problem is that our grammar has confused us, right? The internet is not like the chair. It's a mass noun, like the traffic. And what that means is you can't like take apart the traffics and like get individual traffic. And you can't take apart the internet and get like individual components. All you get are more internets. What's underneath, that if you've got a lot of traffic, if you take apart the traffic and you separate it into two parts, you've got two parts of traffic. You've still got traffic. And the same thing is true of the internet. If you split the internet in half, you've got two internets. Because the internet is a network of networks all the way down. And if that's the case, and if we really mean that, then the benefits that accrue to us from that are the kind of thing that are emergent properties of collective action. Even though that kind of collective action environment also means that you have the problems of first movers and all the rest of it, right? Collective action is a well-known economic problem where you get these sorts of tragedy of the commons kinds of situations. And what that means, and I think Alissa illustrated this beautifully in her opening remarks, what that means is that when you are designing something that you want to get people to deploy, and you think that it's advantageous to the whole system, you have to do it so that the interests are aligned such that everybody involved makes the right decision, despite the fact that the right decision is not, the right decision is for the collective. It's also got to be the right decision for the individuals. Whenever you design a thing that requires everybody to act correctly, but they don't get the benefit themselves, it's very difficult to get that, that kind of proper action. So one of the mistakes that we've made in a few of the cases, in particular, I can think in both DNSSEC and in a different sense in BGP sec, there is this problem where there's a tendency in the development of it to try to centralize things, partly because these are core technologies in the internet, and they tended to have this problem where you naturally wanted a kind of centralization. This is particularly obvious in those two examples because they're both tree structures, right? The DNS is a tree structure because of the way the name system works, and it turns out that it was also a hierarchical system for the numbering system, and so it turned out that there was this natural tendency to put a root of trust. But of course, we don't need to deploy these things that way, and it might be that we could have made better decisions by deploying things in a more peer-to-peer way. What this suggests, of course, is that the question of who decides needs to be resolved by saying, well, everyone decides, and therefore, when we're making technical decisions, we need to make those decisions with the idea that everybody's going to decide in their own interests. So when we do this, and I think that Olafur was exactly right, the ITF in particular, but I believe other standards bodies, as Alissa was mentioning, have all learned this lesson, that if you try to do things from a centralized or top-down directive kind of approach, you're going to have a permanent problem on the internet because people are not going to respond to that unless it's in their interests. Each of us then has this sort of responsibility and also this advantage that we can influence things in the right direction simply by doing the right thing. The last thing that I would say is that this traffic analogy sort of holds up in another way. When we were coming down here, we got into a traffic circle, and I said, "Who designed this?" And of course,
and I said, Lafayette.
Yes, and I said, "Well, wait a minute, but he didn't do it for cars." And then I realized, oh, this is a perfect analogy for this. John Culkin once said that we shape our tools, and thereafter they shape us. And that's what's happened with the internet, right? We've made a world, and it's taken on a sort of independent existence from us. We can't just change that and say, oh, well, who decides? The world is not infinitely plastic. The street grid of Washington, D.C. is the way it is, and you can't completely remake that without radically interrupting the way the world is. We've done it from time to time, right? Put an expressway through the middle of large cities and so on. It's very, very disruptive. And you wreck a lot of lives while you do it. Well, we don't want to do that really with the internet. We get a lot of benefit from it. And we had a top-down centralized network once before, and it didn't work out so well. So we built this one that is cheaper and it drives more innovation. And for that reason, I think, when we take seriously this idea that the answer to who decides is, well, we all decide, then we all have this responsibility to design things so that the individual incentives are aligned correctly. And we have the responsibility to worry about how our network contributes to the pollution on the network, so we have denial of service attacks and so on. Everybody has this responsibility to be an actor in that internet and also to design things correctly. Just the same way you have this responsibility in your neighborhood, don't litter on the street, or you have this responsibility to follow the rules of the road and so on. With that, thanks.
Thanks, Andrew. Our next speaker is Chris Boyer. Chris is Assistant Vice President for Global Public Policy at AT&T. Chris, in that role, he is responsible for the company's public policy positions and advocacy related to cybersecurity and national security. He also is the chair of the U.S. government's Information Security and Privacy Advisory Board, which is run by NIST, and is the point of contact for the President's National Security Telecommunications Advisory Council for AT&T. And he's also the chair of the Cybersecurity Committee of the Communications Sector Coordinating Council, which does planning on behalf of the communications industry with the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. And he's been at AT&T for 25 years. Chris?
Yeah, thanks for having me here. So I am the one person on the panel who is more on the policy side of this issue, but I work very closely with our Chief Security Office and the technical team on these items. So I'd like to think I slept at a Holiday Inn Express last night, so I know enough to be dangerous on these issues. So with that said, a couple things about ISPs and kind of how we do security. Going back to the comments that Alissa made and others have made about standards, I mean, we're very active in the standards community on trying to implement internet security standards. We participate in the IETF, 3GPP, I could go on a litany of standards bodies that we're involved with. Particular to security, we have a group that we've worked with at the Federal Communications Commission called the CSRC, the Communications Security, Reliability, and Interoperability Council, if you can digest all that. And that group has been working on security standards for the industry dating back to the first time we did internet security standards was I think in 2002. And there's probably 400 plus different standards and things that have been addressed at one point in time through CSRC. CSRC is an ongoing thing, so it used to be called the INRIC, the Network Reliability and Interoperability Council, and now it's called CSRC, and we've been, I think right now we're on CSRC 6, thank you. So we're currently on CSRC 6. There's a topic right now that's being focused on around SF7 security and also diameter, and we'll eventually get into some 5G related matters. So we've been doing these security work for quite some time. We did a CSRC report, speaking specifically to BGP and DNSSEC, we did a CSRC report, I think it was in 2012, on both BGP-SEC and DNS-SEC at the time. It had some recommendations for what ISP should be doing to kind of implement those different protocols. I will say, kind of going to the previous comments, one of the challenges that we have with both of those issues is kind of the chicken and egg effect, where basically, like take for example BGP-SEC, when you're talking about route validation, you're kind of waiting for, well, from an ISP's perspective, we can do route validation, but we have to have something to validate against. And there's this ongoing tension about who is actually going to create kind of the tool that you validate the routes against. And to my knowledge, that issue has not been fully settled. So there's a lot of discussion going on about how to do that. NIST, in the last, I guess, 6 months, has launched an initiative to do some case studies on BGP, SEC, and RPKI at the NIST Cybersecurity Center of Excellence. So they're trying to do what they can to kind of push it forward. And so AT&T, we just signed a CRADA to work with them on that project. So we're very interested in seeing how it goes. But there's still a challenge with, it's like anything else that involves kind of a PKI type of system. Everybody, to the points earlier, everybody's kind of got to play their role and be willing to step up to these issues. And so for it to truly work. And so there's an issue of how do we create the right incentive structure for that to happen. I think it's what the previous panels were talking about. Same thing on DNSSEC. DNSSEC is a little bit different in that my security team still has some concerns with DNSSEC because of the issue of DNS amplification and reflection attacks. But I think it's a very similar issue in that for that really to truly work, you need all of the domains need to be signed and validated against, and so we're continuing to look at that as well. But we've been talking about these issues, God, I think the first time I had a conversation about DNSSEC was probably 8 or 9 years ago at least, something like that. So it's been a while. But the industry is well aware of them. We're looking at them, and we want to help on security to the extent that we can, as long as it makes sense and that we get the community kind of rallied around some of these solutions.
Thanks. Well, I want to open it to questions. I have some questions prepared if there are any, but I know that this audience usually has tons of questions. So Mike, why don't we start? Are you giving a Twitter question? Oh, I have to give it's Tech Decides, right? The hashtag Tech Decides.
Nelson with Cloudflare. You've given us lots of examples of things that have been adopted. Could you give us an example from the last 10 years of something that somebody pushed either at the IETF or one of the other standards bodies that sure seemed like a good idea, but somehow it just didn't quite work out? If you could talk a little bit about
I think that is a great
like 10 examples.
Do not track. Tell us more. There was a proposal that browsers would be able to tell the sites they visit to that they did not want to be tracked between sites. So there was a flag created in the HTTP protocol to express that. And there was a significant effort placed on trying to get that adopted by the various parties, and including the people who will have most benefit from tracking, i.e. in that case the advertising industry. And they were all behind it until certain browser vendors said, we're going to turn it on by default. Then it was a bad idea. So, yeah. So nobody pays attention to that flag anymore.
Any other?
So, yeah, I mean, interestingly, I have an example which is the same vein. But I think, one of the challenges with Do Not Track is that it sort of required this framework of interpretation to be established around it, and there could never really be consensus on that. Mm-hmm. At the other end of the spectrum, I worked on something called GeoPriv many years ago. I was out in the audience, which was actually trying to standardize a way to communicate quite expressive rules about what you wanted to have happen to your location information when it was sent in HTTP or DHCP or SIP. And so we thought at the time that was a great idea, but sort of failed for kind of similar reasons. Like nobody actually wanted to be on the receiving end of this and having to interpret, well, I told you that I only wanted you to keep my location information for 24 hours, and now you have to somehow design your retention policy on the server side to match that. It was overly complex and never saw deployment, and got completely sort of overcome by events when GPSs in everyone's device suddenly became the norm around a year or two after we started the work. That was the example that I was thinking of.
Andrew, do you have one too, or?
Oh well, I'm gonna go slightly further because I think that these are two great examples, and in both cases, they're examples where some piece of the incentive structure didn't work the way we needed it to. Another example actually is in the announcement for this workshop, of course, which is DNSSEC. And the interesting thing about that is that's an example that has a different problem, or another different problem, which you mentioned, and that is among the other incentive issues, there was this problem that if you turned it on, it made certain kinds of things worse. Right? The DNS was traditionally really easy. You turned it on and you could run the thing in a closet for 16 years and not know, as long as the fans didn't die, whether the thing was, even where it was. In fact, there are always these apocryphal stories about servers that have literally been walled in on all sides because it's just working and you wouldn't touch it. Nobody knew it was there anymore. So I think that that's an example where we introduced state into the DNS in order to avoid replay attacks, and suddenly everybody had a much more complicated environment. So the poor suckers who had to implement this thing, they were like, wait a minute, I've got a budget of 1/1,000,000th of an FTE to administer this system, and you've just told me that I got to re-sign my domains every month. That's a nightmare. So that's one issue, and the other issue, of course, is that the response sizes got bigger, and that created other kinds of issues on the internet. So I think one thing is exactly whether the incentives are aligned correctly, and the second thing is what are the side effects, and what kind of change is that making to the internet, and what does that do to your deployment story? And I think it's fair to ask, do we always think about these things when we're designing the technologies, and is that analysis being done correctly? Which is a little different from the who decides, right? What is the decision-making process, and have you thought about it all the way through?
You're fine.
I could just quickly comment on the DNSSEC issue.
Yeah.
I mean, the biggest issue.
Well, let me just push it further into a way that I think will illuminate a little bit more. I mean, is DNSSEC, is it failed? Because some people have still implemented it, right? I mean, it's not totally failed. I mean, we're not giving up on DNSSEC with that statement. It's just that it's difficult to implement, right? So
difficult to operate.
Difficult to operate. Thank you.
Difficult to operate, and there's a question about
go ahead. So take it from
if your goal with DNSSEC is to prevent cache poisoning attacks and those types of things. The question ultimately is, what are the trade-offs between implementing DNSSEC, or do you have other means to address cache poisoning? And I think from an AT&T standpoint, our security team looks at it and says, well, they saw a big increase in amplification attacks from entities that were using DNSSEC, and they even have I have a chart I was looking at before I came here today where we presented this at the INSTAC, that 9 of the top 20 domains that have been hit with the largest reflection attacks happen to belong to the U.S. government. And those domains all have implemented DNSSEC. So our security team would argue that a lot of the challenge, that the reason those domains had such big reflection attacks was because of that. Now, I don't know if that's, that's an assumption that they're making, but that's one. So we look at it and say we've invested so much in our resources and capability to detect other means to find things like what we think would be cache poisoning and other types of attacks, or man-in-the-middle attacks. It's so are there other ways to solve for the problem without going down the path of doing DNSSEC, which can create this issue with amplification attacks? And you can have a debate. There'll be a lot. We at the CISRIC, we had an extensive debate with a lot of engineering people who thought that we should do DNSSEC anyway because it was the right thing to do for the internet as a whole. Then you have a debate from the guys who actually are running the security team who feel like, hey, my job is to keep everything secure and I don't want any more of these amplification attacks, so I'd rather wait and see what happens. And honestly, I think both positions technically are probably right. They both have a lot of merit on both ends. And so that's why some of these things become difficult to get deployed, because you can make a valid point on either end of that argument, I think. So.
I've got a question from my colleague, Laura Denardis, who is following along on Twitter. She wishes she were in the room. She really does.
We'll wave hi.
Hi, Laura. Laura's wondering, and I think I'm going to make a slight generalization out of the question. When you're thinking forward about standards, how do you think about openness and security simultaneously? And Laura wants to know this specifically in the context of IoT.
No one seems eager to answer that one, though.
Everybody's third rail.
But I guess in the context of the IETF, the openness security tension isn't as prevalent, I guess I would say, or it's not really top of mind, because I feel like a lot of the tension between openness and security has to do with how things then go get implemented, whether you take the tools that we give you and then go lock down your network so that nobody can join it versus operating it in a more open fashion. But I'm trying to think of an example that doesn't fit that mold, but it tends to be a decision which is more dictated by how you decide to implement something as opposed to how we decide to design the standard. I'm trying to see if I can come up with an example that is contrary to that, but I can't really. Yeah.
Can we dig in a little bit more just on incentives in general? I mean, all of you touched on it in your statements, and Alissa gave the example of TLS implementation, which I think is a really good one, where it was not widely implemented at the beginning. I mean, SSL was sort of haphazardly implemented on e-commerce sites and on forums, right? And then now we see TLS implemented everywhere. What is the incentive process that happened to get to that point, and how do we extend that to other standards?
That's a really good question. The people, for the longest time, thought cryptography was too expensive. Operators are always worried about that they are going to run out of resources, or they have to go and buy more hardware. And what it happens is that simply implementations got better. The hardware that we have is now providing hardware assist for encryption. So basically, the overhead of doing the encryption is becoming so low that it is in the noise. It is, and that is what happens. We have got faster hardware, we've got faster pipes, we have got more capable devices. IoT devices are still repeating this argument that we have to be conservative because we don't have too many cycles, we don't have that. And they are complaining about that they don't have to get the products out in the price point that is going to be competitive. So there is a serious pressure on saving, and making it cheap. And that is where people make shortcuts. We need more of a mindset change than a standards change to make devices secure. The first question people should be asking, and it should of course be obvious that that's the question, is how can my device go wrong? And then you ask the next question, can you break my device? Get others to look at it. Because in every case that we have had a serious incident is because it is an act of omission at some point in the process.
Any other thoughts on that?
Yeah.
Go ahead. I was just going to say, I mean, my observation would be like on the encryption example. I mean, it seems to me that there's a lot of momentum around encryption because people's expectations are now have shifted from where they were several years ago, right? With all the incidents that have happened and all the things in the news that have occurred, it seems like, I mean, I just feel like the best incentive is to have an actual demand from your customers that they get these things. And I think that's what's happened largely on the internet these days, and that's what's driven companies more in that direction, is that their customers have an expectation that their data is going to be encrypted and protected. And that train left the building, 5 years ago, when all the revelations came out about some of these other programs, which I won't go into here, but there's an obvious reason for that. So I think to me that's the greatest incentive. If I have, and even for DNSSEC, like AT&T itself, we have customers like in the U.S. government that we actually would work with on deploying that type of technology if that's what they wanted to do. So when your customers ask for it, I think that's the greatest incentive for any business.
Yeah, I was going to say that, as much as it would be great if we could take credit entirely on the engineering and design side that we just, close this gap, I do think that certainly the initial stimulus was around the Snowden disclosures. But I wanted to also come back to Andrew's point about tools and tools shaping us versus us shaping the tools, because I think occasionally you do have sort of sea change in the tools that are available, and that can create a difference. And I think it's a good question as to whether Let's Encrypt is one such tool. So Let's Encrypt is the free certificate authority from which anyone can obtain a free certificate for use in the web PKI. And I think the establishment of Let's Encrypt as a CA offering search to the public has been correlated certainly with the uptake in the use of TLS, and just made everything from an implementation standpoint dramatically easier for people kind of in all parts of the web, but in particular in the long tail. People have no idea what they're doing administering their website, but suddenly they can just have it be secure for free and with simple tooling. And so I think that's one of the rare occasions potentially when you can look at a tool set like that and say, hey, that actually really made a big difference.
There was this interesting thread, though, that was in the question that I don't want to lose, and that is this question about openness versus security, particularly in the context of Internet of Things. When I heard that, hence the third rail remark, there is this idea that because most of these devices, I mean, Olafur is right, that there are people who are arguing, oh, the hardware could never do this. And I'm like, the hardware caught up with that while you were saying that. But never mind. It's moving so quickly, right? So in any case, there are a lot of people who think that in order to protect these things, what we've got to do are build better walls around these devices that are quite bad. Last night, it just so happens, I followed a thread from Schneier's blog to this thing about the history of walls and about how walls fail. And I forget who it was, but you know Schneier's blog, so you can all find it. And it was really interesting. And so when I was much younger, I had a summer job in an old fort. I got to dress up and be an old soldier. And I learned like an unreasonable amount of things about Vauban type fortifications and how they worked and why they evolved the way they did and so on. And the thing that was very interesting to me about this article was it made this explicit link with this idea, oh, you've got this wall and it's going to be impregnable and all the rest of it. And the history of empires is their walls falling down. And so then if you're trying to design your network to be impermeable by building the walls thicker and thicker around it, the question is not whether you're going to fall to these attacks. The question is when. And so you need to think a little bit differently about it. And if we can get that message across, of course, it changes the incentive on the part of the people who are deploying these things.
Good point. Doug?
Directed at anyone. I was wondering if you think there's any potential downside to, in particular, encryption and security being too easy. Two things come to mind. Is the last time I saw there were 14,000 Let's Encrypt certificates that had the string PayPal somewhere embedded in them. So the sense that there was an enrollment function there that provided value is kind of missing. And the second thing I think about is with the ability to encrypt everything in DNS priv, many defense systems rely on seeing traffic, whether it's deep packet inspection is one thing, but even just behavioral analysis of what's going on. And when I look at, some hosting services that are randomizing 16 bits of a v6 address for every query of where the server is, I think about your ability to sit in the middle and understand anything about what's going on is rapidly eroding. And lots of defense systems rely on understanding what's going on.
So that's a very good question, and I think both of those topics very much under discussion in the IETF and outside. I think on the first point, part of the question gets to what is your expectation of what is signaled by an encrypted connection, right? So it's not the case that what you mentioned couldn't have been possible before there were free certs. Like certainly it was already the case, right? But now it's just easier to do. And I think what that does is it forces the issue around what is actually being communicated to the user as part of the existence of that certificate. And so I think it's kind of a new avenue in the conversation, but not necessarily to be considered a good or bad thing. It's just really forces the issue around what's being communicated to the web user. I think on the question of the sort of manageability and troubleshooting of networks, I think, again, what that is forcing is a bunch of conversations around, okay, now we have a new engineering problem, right? It's not necessarily the case that you can't do everything that you needed to be able to do to manage your network that you could do before, but you probably have to do it differently. And so there's been this expectation of like, well, all of our tools are, what they're expecting is that they have all the whole payload in clear text, and like, why, what are we going to be able to do? That is like a perfect setup for an engineering problem that a bunch of really smart people can get together and start to figure out, hey, I think that there's actually still a lot of information leaking out there from traffic analysis, and there's a lot that you can learn from looking at the patterns of encrypted payloads and so on and so forth that can tell you a lot of what you really need to be able to do some of these things. It's just that that's not how we've done them in the past. And so, we're currently having several different broad discussions in the IETF about just how far to push that, and if we do end up in a place where a lot of the tools need to change, how are we going to change them? Just to give a concrete example of this, I mentioned Quick, in the Quick protocol, there's been this extended conversation about revealing a single bit in the header, right? So, so the proposal is that we have one bit that helps people to understand the round trip time of the connection, and there's been people who say, no, we can't reveal that because it might disclose some generic information about the location of the user on the internet, and we're really trying to protect that. And we have people saying, all I'm trying to get is one bit so that I can manage my network, right? And that's where we are in the conversation right now. And there's not going to be like any easy answer, and there's not going to be one answer either. That's the other thing. I think there's some people who are sort of expecting that we, like, as an engineering community, come down and say, this is where the line is between manageability and security. Like, that's an unreasonable expectation, right? There's going to be many different answers depending on the use case for managing the network and the use case for securing it, but all, I think, good opportunities to engineer new solutions to these problems.
Yeah, there's no, I mean, to your second part of your question, I mean, that's an issue that we've been trying to keep up with for a long time because of the, as an ISP, we are sitting in the middle of a lot of these transactions. A lot of our security tools are predicated upon, most of them are predicated upon seeing the header information, so it's really the IP address, the source port, destination, that type of information, which even in HTTP 2.0 is generally, I think, going to continue to be available. The payload information is the other aspect of it, but it does limit what we can do. So it has, to Alyssa's point, it's forced us to look at other types of analytics tools and other capabilities to try to detect attacks, at the network level. That's generally what we focus on. So I think it is going to change it's going to make it more challenging, from an engineering perspective. I think the engineers probably like that because it gives them something to go look at and try to figure out how to do. But it's definitely going to be more challenging, and so we'll see how that changes over time. The one thing we have pointed out is that there is a tendency, if I put my policy hat on, a lot of people have said, ISPs should just stop all this bad stuff happening on the internet. And that makes it almost impossible. There's limits to what you can do when you only have visibility into the header information and can't see the payload, and so we have to be realistic about what each party in the ecosystem can actually do. And I think the encryption issue, while I'm not advocating against encryption because we all think that's a good thing from a security perspective, but it does make it more challenging from an ISP's perspective.
Like I said earlier, it all depends on your perspective. If the operators or protocols give government like the US government ability to monitor what's happening, we have also given that same ability to any repressive government anywhere in the world where if we are disclosing too much information, we are possibly disclosing it to somebody who the end users have absolutely no interest in having that information. So it is totally dependent on your position when you come to the standards debate, what it is that you want to protect and what is most important. And frequently in the IETF and other standards forum, we have had a limited participation by certain groups who have important opinions until it's sometimes too late. And then they throw a fit. Yes. Yes.
Follow-up question to Professor Donatus's question. So, with the advent of the Internet of Things, we're going to get a lot more players, people who haven't been connecting their devices to the Internet before. So, I got a sense that, Olafur said, in the beginning we all knew each other. Okay, it's bigger now, it's more complex, but it's still a lot of repeat players. But now you're going to get a lot of people who aren't repeat players. Well, they aren't repeat players. They make the devices and they sell them and they don't worry anymore. How do you think that's going to change who decides? Because they're kind of deciding, except they don't seem to necessarily be in the conversation.
Yeah.
No, go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah.
I've heard this before. In the 1990s, we had the beginnings of firewalls and network monitoring equipment. Many of the implementers of those devices, they implemented it with what we would call a TCP dump. Basically, they looked at traffic sampled from somewhere and made sure their device understood everything about that. They never read the RFCs. They never read any of all the other standards. And whenever they saw something that was not in this PCAP they went from or this back of the envelope, it was there. We have always had bad devices being deployed on the internet. it's not going to end. It's not going to get better. It's not going to get, hopefully it's not going to get worse. If anything, it will get better. But yes, there is always going to be people who don't know what they're, or don't know as much as they should.
I mean, if people are having their servers walled in, then that's going to happen, right?
Yeah.
So I'm pleased that you're so optimistic, but I would just to pile on a little bit with this question. I want you to think for a moment about the fact that, you know, some automobile companies hooked their cars up to the internet and suddenly discovered that the car could be controlled remotely by somebody over the internet. And the interesting thing about that is it wasn't news, right? Because previously the same researchers had done this via the CD player. They put malware into the CD player. Because it turned out that once you hooked the CAN bus, which is the system that controls the car, up to the CD player, you'd already made the mistake. And what we're going to do over the next several years is we're going to have to convince everybody in the entire universe how to manufacture things that are connected to the internet. And we haven't figured out how to teach people who make computers how to do that yet. So our potential to do this correctly is low. I think we're going to make a lot of mistakes. But this is not the first time we've made a lot of mistakes, right? We had technical, we have various technologies that we've introduced to our contemporary world over time. We introduced automobiles, for instance, right? So we introduced automobiles to a world that didn't have automobiles, and we completely remade the world with them. And I don't think anybody who made an automobile in the early days thought that what was going to happen was suburban strip malls, but that's what happened. And I think that consequence is one of the things that we can think a little bit about. You know, what are the consequences of this? But if you go back and read, for instance, the Corbusier or any of that sort of optimistic machine age architectural, you know, optimism from the early car age, right? He wasn't imagining, you know, strip malls. He was imagining there was the great future of movement, and you're going to get in your car and you're just going to go. And then we drove down here. So I think that kind of experience is one of the ones that we need to be prepared for as a culture. That our culture is going to change, and it's going to change in ways that we don't exactly understand, and it will have a bunch of security implications that maybe we haven't fully thought about. That doesn't mean we should do this sort of blindly. It means that we need to think about each one of those things very carefully. Now, the one thing that makes me a little bit nervous about this, and I hope my employer isn't listening too carefully, one thing that makes me a little bit nervous about a lot of this is that several of those industries are already heavily regulated. And if the answer that we come up with to this is we're going to extend the regulatory regime that we made for the meat world into the internet, then I think we're going to do a lot of damage to a piece of technology that has been of tremendous benefit to all of us. But that does mean that those who are making these technologies need to be responsible about how they do it, or we're going to end up with the worst of all worlds, right? We'll have regulation that doesn't apply to the domain that we're regulating, and we'll end up with regulations that don't match the use cases anyway. That will pervert the network environment. It will not actually solve the problem, and we will end up with something that doesn't yield the benefits that we want. And that really is one of those collection action problems that keeps me up at night.
So I think that's a really good point. I think you know, the car model reminds me of, you know, that you have this. You were discussing it in terms of the, you know, we don't necessarily know what all the security problems are going to be, but it also reminds me that at the time the cars came out, people made these security claims about what would happen in the future that either have happened and people don't care about anymore, or didn't really materialize in that same way. The big example that I can give is there was a Supreme Court case where there was one of the justices wrote a dissenting opinion saying that there was a concern about cars because criminals would have cars and they'd be able to outrun the police, right? So that, I think, you know, demonstrates the way people thought about it at the time when the new technology was coming out. That isn't necessarily something that's not a concern right now. Maybe they can outrun the police, but generally speaking, police have faster cars and have other ways to catch them, right? So, Mike.
Politics can be pretty complicated and sometimes pretty passionate. The real mess gets when you have national politics, for example. And I think of the example from 15 years ago when the Chinese decided they wanted to reinvent Wi-Fi. Something better. They
talk a little bit about how it works when national governments try to push their technology, why they do that, and how often this is? If I had an answer for why governments do things, I would be richer than I am today. I just want to be clear about that. But look, okay, suppose that some government of anywhere decides it likes a technology and it wants to push it. There are two possibilities in that case. Either they've really invented something that's better, and it solves a bunch of problems that people have, in which case people are going to get the benefit from it, and I don't really care where it came from. Or else it's a scheme that has these, has a bunch of negative consequences. And the advantage of the situation that we're in standards bodies like the IETF, where we have these things where we fight about them, and we fight about them in the open, is precisely that those disadvantages come out, that we have this debate and we expose those things. And if we decide, oh, well, no, we want to go into a dark room and like negotiate this thing among governments, then we have a different kind of problem. I will point out that we made that network once before, right? We already did that, and we decided over time that the internet provided better innovation, faster and cheaper, and so it was better to have the open standards process than something that was made entirely by governments and their national monopolies. So I think that the pressures from usability tend to drive things in the interests of what's deployable and advantageous on the network. We have the great benefit that we've already built a network that has that tradition of open standards, and we see what the benefits are. When people come along with their proprietary standards, we frequently find that it chafes a little bit. We can see that even, for instance, on the web, where there was, in the early days of the web, there were all these proprietary technologies, and you had to download all these plugins and everything like that, and everybody's gone to HTML5 now. Every time I get nagged for one of those plugins, I'm just like, oh, I don't want to look at your website now. So I think that that's the tradition that we've grown up in, and I think that I suspect that will continue to be the pressure because of the incentives issue that we talked about at the beginning.
And
I guess we talked about how governments do it for protectionist reasons. They do it
Sure.
for continuity.
I mean, there's lots of reasons they do it. There's also surveillance. I mean, 30 years ago in a hotel room not too far from here, the IETF met and decided that they would ignore the FBI. The FBI stood up and said, you're designing IPv6 and you're still going to let people be anonymous. That's a bad thing. And the community said, no, that's a good thing. But are there other reasons? I mean, I'm just curious whether we've seen other attempts for national governments to push an answer that is against usability or against user needs, but it's good for
national
government.
governments, right? I mean, I can think of a dozen people. I can think of people in my own corporation who occasionally, have their incentives, and it's not just because they want to do something nasty or they want to do some kind of control or something like that. Sometimes they got a legitimate interest. That's literally the balance exactly that you were talking about earlier between how the network is managed and the encryption on the network, and what's the interplay between these things. The answer to that is more discussion about what the incentives are and what the advantages are and what are the trade-offs that we want to make. And it's a network of networks. If you're in one network and you don't like that particular thing and you want to use the less encrypted version or whatever on your corporate network because your compliance people need to view the traffic, well, it's your network. Go nuts.
Okay.
I don't make rules.
So just to get real basic about this, we hear the phrase splinter net, and the idea that we're going to see not an internet of internets, but honest-to-God national networks that don't really work very well with each other. I mean, of the four of you, does anybody think we're actually going to end up with a splinter net in 10 years, or are the advantages for a global network so clear that we'll keep it together?
Don't have people make predictions. Yeah. So I'm not going to answer that question, but I did have an answer to your previous question, which is, or just something else to throw into the mix, which is that we have a bunch of examples where we've had people who work for national governments or regulatory bodies who have come and brought their requirements into the IETF and been very successful. So emergency services and telephony and broadband measurement and mapping and television white space database, right? Like we have all these different examples where as long as people understand the parameters of how they engage, that no, this is not where you come and tell us what to do, but this is where you come and present what your use case is, and we talk about whether those requirements are broadly applicable on the internet, then yeah, we can forge something which then gets used very broadly across many different jurisdictions, or that catches on because we did something where there was one government who thought this was a good idea and a bunch of other people too, and then it turns out that it's broadly useful. So I do think we have a lot of those very practical kinds of examples as well. But yeah, I think, this is not like an IETF position, but to your question about the fracturing of the network, I think that this is not the first point in time at which this has been a conversation, right? And so, but I think the longer that we have the global interoperability, as people have said, the harder it gets to actually step away from that, right? Because there's a bias to stay as you are. So my hope is that that is what keeps the thing together, even as the pressures around wanting to tear it apart might change or evolve.
I think the tension that you have is that the internet as it was designed was an open system that was designed to let people connect, and there's a lack of fundamental trust in the way it was designed. And so as we see the security incidents kind of ratchet up and get worse and worse in people's minds anyway, especially in government's minds, they're asking the question of how do we build in a layer of trust and then what's inherently an open system like that. And I don't know the answer to that question, but I think that tension is going to continue to exist. And if we don't come up with, if the industry doesn't come up with ways to implement standards and practices to manage some of these security threats, you increase the percentage and the likelihood that governments are going to try to create a fractured or bifurcated internet to deal with their concerns, because we have to be able to demonstrate that we are, proactively addressing some of these problems. I don't think the current situation can continue for too long before there's going to be a reaction from the political class. And if we're talking about things like the IoT, that's already being discussed. Like in the EU, they're already having active discussions about empowering Alissa to go draft guidelines for IoT devices because of security concerns. Those guidelines could quickly become mandatory. I think the same conversations are happening in the U.S. Congress here in D.C. So I think there is a bit of pressure, I think, on the industry side to come up with practical solutions to these issues. We have to do that, because otherwise I think we're going to continue to see the concerns go up, and that increases the odds of what could possibly be a bad outcome.
I'm also, just one more thing before, I'm also a little bit nervous about this term splinternet. It's something that people, the idea, right, that you're going to fracture everything into a tiny million little pieces. And I think that there's a certain amount of fear mongering that's going on there, because it's true that that there are countries, for instance, that are cutting various parts of the country off, or cutting users off, or cutting users off from various applications. But that has been true in every corporate network I've ever worked in my entire adult life. There are parts of the internet that don't work with that corporate network, and they never have, and that was true on purpose. This was the point that I was saying about people in my corporation who want those kinds of things. Of course they do. No employer that I've ever had has wanted its employee payroll database to be on the public internet. That's a thing that we don't want, and I'm grateful. Well, maybe not completely grateful, because maybe I could have logged in and changed the numbers. But apart from that, I think that there's a real, there's this fear of that, which is justifiable until you start to think about, okay, if you really want to do that to your country, for instance, you really want to filter things that way, what you're really saying is, I know what the winners are going to be. We know what political moves that pick winners like that do to, to the players in there. They don't pick the winners always correctly. And I think that means that there's an incentive, even at the nation-state level, to be a little more open about that, because your citizens demand it, the users of the network want it, and you are hobbling yourself. You're giving up on the creativity and the advantages that everybody else gets to enjoy. So I think once again the incentives actually tell us a good story. I like to say on the internet there are no carrots; it's only sticks. Or it's only carrots. Backward. It's only carrots. That it's all reward, right? You can't beat people into playing. And I think that that's a really important piece of the incentive story here that will.
So let me pick up on that. It's an idea that I want to try and get at some point, which is what are the things that governments can do to give the carrots, right? What are the carrots and what has worked from a government point of view? Because I think their immediate reaction is to go straight to the sticks, right? And so what can we put out there as the carrot that works in this space? Because I think it's more complicated than the stick.
Well, I mean, the first thing that I would point out is, they gave us the carrot. They literally grew the carrot and said, "Here you go, people. Here's carrots." That's literally what happened, and we continue to reap the benefits of that.
I would say that the Chinese don't see it that way, but the U.S.
Well, I mean, that may be the case, but I think that. I do think that there's a tendency for people to release these technologies and then sort of say, "Oh well, we didn't mean you should do that with it." Just like with your kids, right? You give them some. I am fortunate that I don't have children, but I was the eldest of 4, so I got to see this. And there are these moments, right, where the children do something. You gave them the freedom to do it, and they do the wrong thing. And I think we're at that moment where governments are looking at this and they say, well, we inspired all of this, and now you're not using that tool for the purposes for which you're watching stuff that we didn't want you to watch. So I think that that's one part of it, that literally you just fund it and then you say, hey, we created this great thing and now it's a social benefit. But the other thing that I would say is that there are mechanisms within the culture. Does everybody drive on the right side of the road because otherwise they'd get a ticket? No, they drive on the right side of the road because that's the social norm, and we created this kind of thing and everything like that. If you go to a different country, people drive on the other side, and that's the kind of thing that really does amount to the social environment in which you live, and the government maintains that just by being there. And by promoting the sort of good practices and so on. So it has this convening function that is literally a social function without which we couldn't have the kind of mass society that we do.
Yeah, I mean, I'll speak to this a little bit. I think incentives to me is a tough issue because from an AT&T perspective, we're always concerned about security. So it's not like we need the government to come tell us, hey, you better do a good job on security, because it's a major issue for our business. But that being said,
I think I remember your CEO saying fear is incentive enough.
Yes, exactly. So we already have, but I will say from a policy standpoint, I mean, one of the obvious things that governments can do is provide safe harbor type protections for people who implement certain security practices. And the FTC is kind of doing that a little bit, where they have basically mapped out a regime where they say, that there's a reasonable expectation that companies will do certain things for security. And they've mapped their reasonableness standard to various standards regimes. So like they've said that, so they've made examples of how you could maybe use the NIST cybersecurity framework would be an example of acting reasonably on security. So from a company perspective, if you were using the framework, you could make a credible argument anyway, if you had an issue, that you were taking reasonable precautions from a cybersecurity event, which arguably creates an effective defense if you're ever called in litigation as a result of a cyber incident. So I think governments have tools like that they can lever to tell people, hey, we really want you to do this. We can create an incentive structure to drive you in that direction. They don't need to regulate or use a heavy hammer and say, here's the 10 things that you must, thou must go do. But they can say, and this approach actually kind of works, you can say, we have an expectation you're going to act rationally about security or act reasonably, and then that gives you some flexibility, but also sets the expectation that you're going to do these things. And if you don't, and you're a victim of an attack, or your customers are a victim of an attack, then they can come back with a hammer, later on. So that model has seemed to be what's emerged, I think, in the last few years.
Over, yeah.
I'm going to take this discussion slightly differently. When our governments provide a stick or motivation, it may go across their boundaries. Think of what the Europeans are doing to data collection right now. GDPR. They are basically requiring every company that has any business in Europe or possibly touches on a European citizen to change everything, how things are stored, and at least document how they store things. It's a very expensive effort. Is it for the better? Very arguably so. But what did it take to make that happen? You required a large block of important economies to stand up and say, do it this way. And U.S. has nothing to say about it. If some large countries like Russia or China came up with something of their own, and it was not reasonable, or if it was reasonable, industry would have to adjust to it in some way or fashion. So governments can have a good impact, it can have a bad impact. And picking winners is very hard. Picking what is good also ends up on dealing with an issue like in the ICANN world right now. We are dealing with an information database called WHOIS, which is extensively used by network operators and security folks to find out who has registered for a domain. But under the GDPR, most of the information that is given out there should not be given out. So where suddenly we have all these parties that are stuck between a contractual requirement with their regulator, ICANN, and that they are going to be in a violation of European laws at some point this year.
Yeah, just to build on that one, I also do a lot of work in the policy group at MOG, which is the Messaging and Anti-Abuse Working Group, and we just recently filed comments on the WHOIS issue because of that exact concern that in order to comply with GDPR, some of the information in the WHOIS database would now be no longer available. And MOG focuses a lot on, if you're not familiar with MOG, they focus a lot on abuse desk functions. So the idea of being able to identify internet abuse. And so if we can no longer go into WHOIS and identify some of the abuse function, it really undermines some of that work. And that's actually a really critical thing in dealing with things like spam and other types of messaging attacks. So that needs to be dealt with.
And inside the European Union, there is a big fight going on right now between the law enforcement sites and the privacy sites, exactly over this issue.
Weren't there were a couple options they were looking at to try to deal with?
They were looking at 3 different options, all horrible.
Yeah.
Yes, that's a question, ma'am.
I want to pick up on something Mr. Boyer said earlier about the industry. And I'm also somewhat of a purist, and I was going to say,
Yes, that's a question, ma'am.
I want to pick up on something Mr. Boyer said earlier about the industry. And I'm also somewhat of a purist, and I was going to say, the topic here is choosing new technologies, who decides? And I'm not sure about this yet. I mean, when I hear about the industry, we've seen some real examples lately of the industries don't agree. Players such as, I'll pick Cisco, does these self-fulfilling prophecies that says, build to a video network because video will comprise about 75% of the internet use a few years from now. I want to congratulate you on getting this far into a program without ever mentioning liability, because one of the things, and talking about IoT, because I've been at many IoT conferences lately that within the first 10 minutes, everyone's worried about whose liability. You've mentioned the players who could be liable without even talking about how that will be sorted out. So I'm still lost on who decides. I mean, we're talking about governments now, but is it going to be the industry or industries? Is it going to be the consumers? I mean, who is it going to be?
Well, I mean, I think Andrew's point earlier was that if you're trying to find the guy, stop looking, right? Because there is no guy, right? It's the collective result of the decisions of many different parties, right? And so I think it's a good question of how governments sort of shape the playing field a little bit there, but that to date it hasn't been government action that has been leading the way, and as a result, it's for the rest of us out there to interpret the framework in which we operate and then start making decisions according to whether it's a business decision or an engineering decision or a consumer making a purchasing decision. So I guess that's.
And I also think it doesn't work the same.
It's not like satisfactory, but that's the answer.
It doesn't work the same in every case either. I mean, we could probably point to several examples where government procurement rules. I mean, encryption in general, right? Government procurement rules help set encryption standards. The fact that you had those in place, but then you look at you can go back to DNSSEC. It hasn't. The fact that U.S. government has required DNSSEC hasn't made it roll so that everyone's using it at this point, right? So it did increase the usage, but it has not made it universal. So,
isn't the real question, like, how do we drive community action across the board?
Yes,
I mean,
that's
to me,
probably a
that's,
better way
that's
to
the
phrase
more
it.
that's the better question than it is like who decides. Because we had a little bit of this debate earlier today at the NIST event that, you know, the idea of having like any entity decide, I think, is a really bad idea. I mean, there are certain countries who would love to be put in the position of deciding that. So I think we should focus more on how do we get everybody to live up to their part of the bargain, right? And you know, I work for a big ISP, and so, you know, we like to think that we're doing a lot of things on security. I'm sure there's more we could do, just like anybody else. Anybody tells you they're doing everything they can is probably not telling you the truth. So there's always more things that can happen, but we feel like the industries across the board collectively all are aware of these issues and trying to work on them. I don't think it's any one entity. It's certainly not governments, in my view, because I mean, a lot of these things are being driven by market dynamics. So, you know, it's how do we get everybody to work together and live up to their end of the bargain and work collectively, I think, is really the question.
And to a large extent, what innovation right now is driven by companies and open source projects and various that are willing to take the step forward and move the channel. I'm very proud that I work for Cloudflare, and we made every site that we protect HTTP secure overnight. We have made every site that is behind us, all 8 million of them, they have IPv6 by default, unless the users have said don't. And so moving the standards forward sometimes requires somebody to just step up and go around and say, hey, you others, step up.
Right.
And whoever it is, there are going to be some more steps coming up. HTTP 2 is a real opportunity for people to raise the bar.
Let me say it. I mean, this is a great place to end the discussion. We have time for one more question. I don't know if Andrew, you want to wait. We have two people. Why don't we go do both the questions, and then we'll get answers to them, and you can wrap up in that as well.
Okay. Very quick question. Just want to know what is the representation in organizations like IETF of people and interests from the developing world with regard to their concerns, because the larger markets and users are shifting, you know, which started in the West and the US, but the much larger populations of new users come from the developing world. So I'd just like
Good
to
question.
know.
Alyssa,
So
why don't
why
you answer that one quickly, since it's a direct IETF question, and we'll pass on to the left.
Yeah, so within the IETF community, we have people participating from all over the world. Something like a typical meeting will have people from 70, 80 countries show up. So it's quite diverse in terms of the global spread. The density does sort of skew towards the largest companies in the industry. As a result of that, if you are looking at a country that doesn't have a big IT sector or a strong kind of academic bent towards networking, then you're likely to find fewer people participating from that country. But we do have, we do a lot of our work online and by remote participation, and through that mechanism, we've expanded into pretty much every corner of the world, other than, I don't know how the IP nodes in Antarctica are treating us these days, but it's a pretty global spread.
I want to ask you if you guys are not afraid from the debate about the neutrality of internet to be used as a security argument, and then people would argue that by fixing the packages in the internet and by deciding which package is prioritized, we could diminish attacks as like the DDoS attacks or something like that. Just a reflection question.
I'll try to answer that one really quickly. So even the FCC rules that pre-existed on net neutrality, whether they were the 2010 version or the one that came out in 2015, they both had exceptions in them for network security. So we don't feel like those rules, at least as they were drafted at the time, prevented us as an ISP from filtering or blocking malicious traffic. We actually have been doing that for a long time. Now what we do is we have what's called a broadband information page where we would go out and publish the different, like we did some port blocking, like we blocked port 445, for example, due to some of the issues it created around SMB. So we do that today, and we publish that so our customers are aware of what we're doing there. But generally speaking, we were able to operate within those rules. Now, AT&T obviously has a lot of other issues with net neutrality, which I'm not going to go into because this is not a net neutrality panel. But at least from a network security perspective, there were exceptions for that in the previous rules.
In this space, it is very important for operators to be able to identify obviously bad packets. And there's no problem filtering them that anybody has anywhere. It's the gray area, so what is a good and what is possibly bad. That's where the questions come up. But we have said on a number of occasions that we used to answer during attacks 1 in every 100 DNS packets thrown at us, and nobody complained because that was all bad traffic. But there is all kinds of traffic that is coming from various places for whatever reason. Yes, filtering bad traffic is not, nobody has a problem with it. But identifying what is bad is the challenge.
I should stand corrected in that. You're right about that. Like even irrespective of net neutrality, right?
Yes.
We've always had issues with false positives and other things that come on when you're doing security work. So we are very careful about not over blocking or doing other things. And we have had incidents in the past where we have, blocked stuff for what we thought. We had an issue with 4chan several years ago where we were blocking some stuff because it was initiating DDoS attacks, and they accused us of net neutrality violation for outright blocking them. But we had, in our view, we had very legitimate reasons for doing that because it was facilitating a large attack. So there is always going to be some gray area there. I mean, I'd like to think we can have rational conversations about what's appropriate in that space. We'll see.
So I'd like to try and end on like an optimistic note here. So can we do this, which is, Alissa did this a little bit, and a couple of other people have done it as well. But what technology are you most excited about and that you see kind of moving forward, and that we do have, we're moving towards critical mass on in the security space in the coming months?
In the security space?
Yeah, security.
TLS 1.3.
See, there's a good answer.
TLS 1.3. Yeah.
Next version
Should be
TLS.
Published in like a month or two. It's pretty exciting for my profession.
Same here.
I think I'm optimistic because of the work that is only just starting with the manufacturer usage description. It's not it's not the total answer, but it's the beginning of some answers that allow for automated management of the network. And I'm actually going to give two, because the other piece that I'm excited about is stuff that's going on in HomeNet, which is very early on, but there's some possibilities there for like automatic management of unmanaged networks, and those, if you put those two things together, we actually have solutions to very scary potential, that we spent a lot of time on today. So I actually think that the engineers, if you give smart people, and everybody at the IETF is smarter than me, if you give smart people the opportunity to work on these things, they will come up with unbelievably ingenious answers to these problems. And I don't think we have a shortage of.
So those are both IoT oriented.
Yeah, they are.
Things that are positive, which you rarely hear, but I agree with you on those two.
So I'll give you more of an architectural question. So the big focus that we've had is on software-defined networks and network function virtualization. So the idea of moving, you talked earlier about the kind of Maginot line of security, the perimeter that everybody can just go right around, and the idea being that we can create virtual perimeters around individual asset classes inside a business, so that if somebody gets in, you can quarantine off and limit the damage to that particular set of assets, and you have multiple distributed perimeters inside your business. That's where AT&T is going from a security design perspective. I think architecturally that's where a lot of enterprise businesses should go in the future. So I think SDN NFVs enables a lot of that to happen. So it's, we used to have security appliances, physical appliances, firewalls, and those types of things. We no longer do that anymore. Everything runs on commodity-based servers. It's open sourced, and it's run off of virtualized instances in the cloud. And I think that's where the future is for security design.
Great. So some reasons to be optimistic at the end. Thanks for. Can we thank our panelists, and thanks for everyone for coming here. Thanks to those online.
And thanks to everybody at ISOC for pulling this together with an incredible panel under very short notice. And I look forward to many more events between ISOC, IGL, and SOC in the future.